It's officially Modern Horizons 3 spoiler time, and we have an absurd number of cards to talk about, which means we should probably get right into it. Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it is time for our first official edition of Modern Horizons 3 spoilers. So today, spoiler season kicked off with a huge stream from Wizards, and we have an almost infinite number of cards to talk about. It is going to be a big one. We have so many mythics, so many rares, so many exciting cards for Modern, for Timeless, for Historic, for Commander. So we should probably jump right into it, because I will warn you now, this is going to be a long video. Before we do, 3 quick reminders. First, if you need any of these cards, you can pre-order them from our sponsor Card Kingdom over at cardkingdom.com/mtggoldfish. Second, to keep up on all the latest previews throughout the day, you should head on over to mtgpreviews.com. And third, we got some Commander cards today. In all spoiler season, Tomer's going to be covering the Commander previews over on the MTG Goldfish Commander YouTube. So make sure to head over there if you want to hear about the Commander pre-con cards. Anyway, let's talk Modern Horizons 3. First up today, we get a new cycle of Flipwalkers. We already saw a Johnny a while ago, so we're not going to get into new Johnny again, even though it is a pretty sweet card. So we're going to kick things off with Tamiyo Inquisitive Student. So, new Tamiyo, 1 mana 0/3 legendary Moonfolk Wizard. It is flying. It says, whenever it attacks, you get to investigate, so you get a clue token, and then when you draw your 3rd card of a turn, you exile it and return it to the battlefield transformed under an owner's control. The backside, Tamiyo Seasoned Scholar, a planeswalker with 2 loyalty, has +2 until your next turn. Whenever a creature attacks you or a planeswalker you control, it's -1, -0 until end of turn. -3, return an instant or sorcery card from your graveyard to your hand. If it's green, you get a mana. And then -7, draw cards equal to half your library, rounded up, and you get an emblem with no max hand size. So Tamiyo's actually pretty interesting. On one hand, it's got 0 power, so it's not going to do much as a creature other than maybe make some clues. And the Planeswalker side isn't like super busted. Obviously, if you can get to the ultimate, it's kind of ridiculous. You probably win the game, unless your opponent has the Orcish Bowmasters. Then you probably lose the game on the spot. But still, it can draw a ton of cards if you get to it. The -3 of getting things back to your hand, instants and sorceries, is kind of nice. It does play a little bit of defense. But the most exciting thing about this card is it's really a 1 mana Planeswalker. It's a 0/3. It blocks aggro creatures pretty well. Like, this shuts down a Ragavan attack. It survives Orcish Bowmasters. In some ways, it reminds me of Jace Vryn's Prodigy, where Jace is this 2 mana Planeswalker. The front side's like a looter. The backside, when you look at it, you're like, it's not that exciting. Like, you can, disrupt your opponent's attacks by shrinking a creature for a turn. You can flash back an instant or sorcery, very similar to Tamiyo, returning it back to your hand. And then it's got an emblem that probably wins you the game eventually. Turns out Jace Vryn's Prodigy was actually a really, really good card. And Tamiyo is way easier to turn into Planeswalker mode. For Jace Vryn's Prodigy to become a Planeswalker, you gotta get a bunch of cards in your graveyard. It's gotta lose Summoning Sickness. You have to be able to tap it to loop and then finally flip it. Tamiyo, all you really need to do is cast a Brainstorm. If you cast a Brainstorm style effect, you just immediately get to exile and flip it into Tamiyo. Of course, this isn't going to matter in Modern, but it matters in Legacy, it matters in Timeless, on Magic Arena, and remember, Arena's getting this entire set as well. So I can imagine, even though the backside of Tamiyo isn't like super busted, I think that it probably is good enough in formats that have Brainstorm, just because it's so easy to Tamiyo Brainstorm, draw 3, flip it, and then the backside you like get back a Brainstorm, you get back a Lightning Bolt, you shut down small creatures from attacking, and work towards that Peer into the Abyss style ultimate to close out the game. So I think Tamiyo Inquisitive Student, I actually really like this card. I don't know how much Modern play it'll see. That's actually the format I'm most skeptical of, just because you don't have a Brainstorm in Modern. But in Legacy and in Timeless, I actually think Tamiyo can do some serious work and is a legit scary card, where probably like on turn 2 you just play this Brainstorm, flip it, and then go to town. So I expect Tamiyo's gonna see some competitive play, maybe not in Modern, but at least in Legacy and in Timeless. We also got Sorin of House Markov, which honestly might be my favorite of these new Flipwalkers. So it's a 2 mana 1/4. It has lifelink and extort, so when you cast a spell, you can play a black or white mana to drain for 1. And then it says at the beginning of your post-combat main phase, if you gain 3 or more life this turn, exile it, return it transformed is Sorin Ravenous Neonate. So, Planeswalker Sorin, 3 loyalty, it has extort, so when you cast a spell, you can drain if you want to by paying some mana, +2 create a food token, -1, Sorin deals damage equal to the amount of life you gain this turn to any target. That's the ability that has me really hyped about Sorin. And then -6, gain control of a creature, becomes a vampire, gets a lifelink counter if you control a white permanent other than Sorin. A lot of extra text on there. But what I'm imagining about Sorin, this is a really big butted blocker early in the game, and it's actually super easy to flip this card around. All you gotta do is gain 3 life. That's a single food token. So you got a Gilded Goose and you crack the food, all of a sudden you get Planeswalker Sorin. Maybe you're playing Soul Sisters. This does seem pretty good in Soul Sisters. You play some creatures with your Soul Wardens and Soul Attendants, and maybe extort a little. You flip around Sorin. The reason this card is so scary though is the Planeswalker's ability to -1 deal damage to any target, not creature or Planeswalker, anything like that. You can hit your opponent's face with this, equal to the amount of life you gain, which means you can probably just kill your opponent maybe the turn that you flip Sorin with a Martyrous Sands. Martyrous Sands just gains an absurd amount of life. You pay 1, you sack it, you reveal a bunch of white cards in your hand, you gain 3 times X life. So if you have 7 white cards in your hand, a single Martyr of Sands is going to be able to gain you 21 life. And in a world with the One Ring, it is not unreasonable to have 7 white cards in your hand. So if you can flip Sorin with all your random life gain effects, Martyrous Sands with a bunch of cards in hand, Sorin is just straight up lethal, burn your opponent out of the game, and that ability has me really excited. Even outside of Martyrous Sands, the thing about life gain is it's just costed really efficiently because it can't kill people. So you can gain a lot of life for 1 or 2 mana, but Sorin turns that into damage. As I mentioned before, it also just lines up pretty well with a lot of aggro creatures. This does the Tamiyo thing of shutting down Ragavan, it survives Orcish Bowmasters, but it's even better because it also dodges Lightning Bolt. So I feel like this is a card that's kind of designed to work, and I hate to use this term because I know I've used it so much, but it's designed to be good in Soul Sisters. If there was ever a card that was going to bring Soul Sisters back in Modern, I think it's this one. It just seems so easy to Martyr of Sands kill your opponent. Life goes on, can easily gain you 8 life for 1 mana. That's so much damage with Sorin. Maybe you sack all your lands to Zoradorb and burn your opponent out of the game. Plus, remember, we got cards like Children of the Apocalypse, March of Wretched Sorrows that are already seeing heavy play in Modern, in decks like Cabal Coffers. So there's just so many ways to turn on Sorin. It's so easy to flip it, and the backside is so powerful that I would be surprised if there wasn't some deck that can really abuse this new Flipwalker. So I think Sorin, it's really strong, and maybe not the strongest of the bunch, but definitely my personal favorite of the bunch, and I do expect it to be pretty good. We also got Rao Monsoon Mage / Rao Leyline Prodigy, and this is the easiest Flipwalker to discuss. So the front side, a 2 mana 1/3 legendary human wizard, says instant and sorcery spells you cast cost 1 less to cast, and then whenever you cast the instant or sorcery during your turn, you flip a coin. If you lose the flip, you gotta take a damage. If you win the flip, you can transform into Rao Leyline Prodigy. Worth pointing out there, if you win the flip, you may transform it, so you don't have to transform it. You can just leave it sitting out with the cost reduction fact in its creature mode if you want to. The backside is a Planeswalker with 2 loyalty, except it enters the battlefield with an additional loyalty counter for each instant and sorcery spell you cast this turn, which means it could hopefully be coming in with enough loyalty to ultimate right away. The +1, kind of the same as the front side. Your instants and sorceries cost 1 less cast until your next turn. -2 can deal 2 damage, divide as you choose between 1 or 2 targets, draw a card if you have a blue permanent that's not Rao, and then the big one, -8, exile the top 8 cards of your library. You can cast instants and sorceries from among them this turn without paying their mana cost. So Rao is pretty simple. It is a storm card. Where we see these cost reduction effects like Brawl, Chief of Compliance, Goblin Electromancer really shine is in Storm decks, and Rao fits right in there as well. So compared to Electromancer Brawl, there is some downsides here. I could imagine there's a world where you get low on life, you need to storm off, you need the cost reduction, and the fact that you can lose coin flips and take damage might actually end up killing you, so that is the drawback of Rao. But there's also this huge upside to Rao that I think will give it a home in some number in Storm decks, or at very worst course, people are going to try in Storm decks, and that is, Storm decks are built to cast a lot of spells in a turn. The way these Storm decks work is hopefully you play your Brawler or your Electromancer, and the next turn you just kind of storm off and win the game. What Ral adds to this is you get your Brawler or your Electromancer effect, you cast 5, 6, 7, 8 spells with the front side out. Eventually, once you cast enough spells, you're like, all right, I want to flip, I'm going to flip it, and then you can immediately ultimate with the backside and dig 8 cards deep to find your Grape Shots, your Gifts Ungiven. Essentially gives you like this epic experiment with the backside, except you're doing it all kind of for free. Like, you played a 2-mana thing that you already wanted because you already want a Brawl effect in your deck, and then eventually you just get to cast up to 8 instants and sorceries for free. So I think Ral Monsoon Mage, probably not going to see play in many decks, but I do think this card does have a chance to show up in Storm and maybe even bring the archetype back in Modern. Finally, as far as Flipwalkers go, don't worry, we have like a million more cards to talk about. We have a new Grist in Grist Voracious Larva. So 1 mana 1/2, it's a legendary insect. It has Death Touch. So this is one of those cards. Keep an eye on these cards as we talk about Modern Horizons 3. I believe that Wizards designed a lot of the cards in this set with the Orcish Bowmasters meta in mind. Like Grist, that extra toughness being a 1/2 instead of a 1/1 like a lot of 1 mana creatures. I think that's a shout out to like Dying to Bowmasters. If this had 1 toughness rather than 2, it would probably just be stone unplayable because Bowmasters would snipe it. So I think Wizards designed these cards with Bowmasters in mind. So Grist, 1 mana 1/2 Death Touch. It says when it or another creature enters the battlefield under your control, if it entered from a graveyard or you cast it from a graveyard, you pay a green mana, flip it around into Grist the Plague Swarm. The backside, 3 Loyalty Planeswalker, +1, you make a 1/1 black and green insect creature token, and then you mill 2 cards, and you put a Death Touch counter on the token if a black card was milled this way. -2, blow up an artifact and enchantment. -6, for each creature card in your graveyard, create a token that's a copy of it, except it's a 1/1 black and green insect token. This card is wild. In the right deck, Grist is incredibly easy to flip. Think about Yawgmoth combo in Modern. It's got creatures coming down the graveyard like Young Wolves, thanks to Undying. There's Grave Crawlers being cast from graveyards, Bloodghast returning from graveyards, Grief, when you scam it with Not Dead After All or whatever, is coming back from a graveyard. There's so many tier decks that already have creatures entering the battlefield from the graveyard, so any of these decks can easily flip a Grist. Plus remember, even when you don't flip it, it's a 1 mana 1/2 Death Toucher, so it can trade up with bigger creatures. Once you flip this card's really, really good. Plus you can also lose like Unearth to get it back from the graveyard, a Tyver to get it back from the graveyard, and immediately flip it into a Planeswalker. So in some sort of self-mill graveyard deck, it's really easy to do as well. Once you flip it, it reminds me a lot of Grist the Hunger Tide. And Grist the Hunger Tide is a Planeswalker I've lost to a lot in Modern. Just being able to plus to make an insect token, very effective. It just kind of like slowing down the game. And in some ways, Grist the Plague Swarm is even better because there's some chance you're going to make a Death Touch insect token, which is way better than a non-Death Touch insect token. The ultimates both kind of win the game if you have a bunch of creatures in your graveyard. The only place that Grist the Plague Swarm is worse than Grist the Hunger Tide is really the -2, where Grist the Hunger Tide can blow up creatures or planeswalkers, does make you sack a creature, but Grist the Plague Swarm only gets artifact and enchantment, so it's like a naturalize. But still, I think this card's really good. A 1 mana card that can turn into this planeswalker that has a plus ability to generate tokens that can keep your life total high, can protect you from your opponent's creatures, and then eventually forces into this ultimate that's just going to make a huge board in the right deck. Seems like a really, really good card. So I think Grist, this card might see the most play out of the Flipwalkers right away, just because it can slot into tier decks. It's very easy to be like, I'll play one of these in my Yawgmoth deck. I'll play one of these in my graveyard, Unearth style deck. So there's just ready-built homes. Yeah, it's a legend, so you're probably not going to play, 4 of them or whatever. Plus, remember, it's a creature in like a Yawg deck. You can tutor it up with a Chord of Calling really easily. So there's just so many easy homes for this card. And I think it's powerful enough, both its front side as a Death Toucher and its backside with its token production. This is a card that you're going to see in quite a few decks in Modern. Like I said, probably not as a 4-of, but like as a 1-of or a 2-of. It is that good. Moving on, the Eldrazi Titans are back. We already saw Emrakul a while ago. That was another one of the super early spoilers. Check out the early spoiler video if you want to hear about that. But we also got a new Ulamog in Ulamog the Defiler, and a new Kozilek in Kozilek the Broken Reality. So, new Ulamog. We already had Ulamog, so I guess it's double new Ulamog. But Ulamog the Defiler, compared to past Ulamogs, it's kind of interesting. So, new Ulamog, 10 mana 7/7. When you cast it, target opponent exiles half their library rounded up. It has Ward of Sack 2 permanents, so gonna be annoying but not impossible to kill. And then it enters the battlefield with a number of +1/+1 counters equal to the greatest mana value among cards in exile, and it has Annihilator X, where X is the number of counters on it. So essentially, you cast this card, exile half your opponent's deck. Hopefully they have like a Leyline Binding or something that you exile. It gets 6 counters, it has Annihilator 6. If your opponent wants to kill it, they get a sack 2 permanents because of the ward. That's actually a pretty powerful effect compared to our older Ulamogs. There's some twists here. So for one, both of the old Ulamogs immediately exiled permanents when you cast them, and that was part of the reason that they see play. Like, Ulamog the Ceaseless Hunger still sees play in Tron decks to this day, just because you can cast it and then exile 2 of your opponent's things. The other twist is, both of the old Ulamogs have Indestructible. New Ulamog has Ward of Sack 2 permanents, and it really depends which is better. In some situations, your opponents can have a Solitude, and they just don't care about indestructibility, but they might not want to sack 2 permanents to deal with a ward on Ulamog the Defiler. In other situations, if your opponent, you know, has a targeted removal spell, like a Go for the Throat style effect, being able to sack a couple permanents and kill Ulamog the Defiler, yeah, you'll probably get by with that when you just straight up can't kill the old Ulamogs. So I gotta say, I think overall, this is maybe slightly worse than the old Ulamogs, although I am hyped by the fact that this can get a big Annihilator number. The fact that it gets counters equal to the highest mana value of cards in exile, and then it has Annihilator of that number, is kind of ridiculous. Imagine casting this and exiling your opponent's Emrakul or something, and getting Annihilator 15 on your like 20-something powered Ulamog. So this card, when you cast it, you essentially traumatize half of your opponent's deck. So if you're trying to mill your opponent out, that is pretty good, although I don't know, you can't really play this in a mill deck. How's mill ever going to get to 10 mana? So I think it's more to like support his own ability, but maybe there's some weird Eldrazi mill deck out there where you're like Tron and Mesmeric Orb and then cast this to exile your opponent's deck. Probably a stretch, but it would be funny. As I mentioned, Ulamog the Ceaseless Hunger still see play in Tron decks. If Ulamog the Defiler is going to see heavy play, I think that's really the home for it. Can this beat out Ulamog the Ceaseless Hunger in Tron? My guess is no. I think Tron players really like the immediate gratification of just exiling 2 permanents when you cast it. I think that's better than the like delayed gratification of getting this big ward number and this big Annihilator number for the future. So I think that it's probably like just not quite as good as Ulamog the Ceaseless Hunger, but it still feels like a super epic Eldrazi. The other thing I want to mention, you can reanimate this card. You can sneak attack this card, although it's a little bit awkward because you only get to exile half your opponent's deck if you cast it. So if you're going to try to reanimate it or sneak attack it, you really need another way to get things into exile. Otherwise, this is just going to be kind of a 7/7 ward sack 2 permanents, no Annihilator, no counters, any of that stuff. But it is worth pointing out that it cares about cards in exile, period, not cards exiled with its ability. So you could like Leyline Binding your opponent's biggest thing and then reanimate Ulamog, and it's still going to enter the battlefield with a bunch of counters, have that big Annihilator number. You can have Leyline of the Void to exile stuff from your opponent's graveyard or whatever. So keep that in mind. The growing and getting the counters in this big Annihilator isn't directly tied to its first ability. A lot of times you're just going to cast it, exile half your opponent's deck, and those will be the cards in exile, but you can get cards in exile in other ways. So Ulamog the Defiler, this one's close. I think that it's probably just like slightly worse than Ulamog the Ceaseless Hunger, which might keep it from seeing modern play, but there is some big upsides here with the huge Annihilator number and the fact that, I don't know, if you're a mill deck, being able to exile half your opponent's deck's pretty sweet. We also have new Kozilek and Kozilek the Broken Reality, and I gotta say, this one kind of disappoints me. It just disappoints me kind of like flavorfully. When I think of Eldrazi Titans, I think of the biggest, splashiest, most epic creatures in Magic's 30-year history. Like, that's what Emrakul is. That's what Kozilek is. That's what Ulamog is. But Kozilek the Broken Reality, I don't know, like it's okay. It just doesn't feel that flashy to me. So it's a 9 mana 9/9. When you cast it, up to 2 target players each manifest 2 cards from their hand. So you put them into play as face down 2/2 creatures. If they're creatures, you can flip them up later for their mana cost. And then you get to draw a card for each card that's manifested this way. And then other colorless creatures you control get +3/+2. So it is worth pointing out, Kozilek makes a ton of power. You cast this, you choose to manifest your cards, maybe you manifest your opponent's cards depending on the situation, but you manifest your 2 cards. Those 2/2s are actually going to be 5/4s thanks to Kozilek's pumping ability. So if you think about what you get for 9 mana, you get a 9/9 and 2 5/4s. That is 19 power across 3 bodies for 9 mana. So this does build a huge army. Plus, it is going to draw you at least 2 cards, and if you make your opponent manifest as well, you can draw up to 4 cards with it. So I can see the callbacks to like Kozilek Butcher of Truth, Kozilek the Great Distortion. Both of them drew a bunch of cards. This draws some cards too, maybe not quite as much, but I just don't get the flashiness. There's no Annihilator, there's no discarding cards to counter everything your opponent does. This just like makes a big board that can die to a Wrath or whatever. It does make a really big board. The question is going to be, when do you want to target your opponent with that manifest mode? And I think it really depends on the scenario. Like, if your opponent is a control deck, probably making your opponent manifest a couple of counter spells or whatever, that's probably going to be a good thing. If your opponent's a creature deck, it gets a little sketchier. And the other question is, do you want your opponent to have blockers? So you're just trying to like swing in the next turn and kill your opponent with Kozilek and its manifest army? Do you want your opponent to have extra blockers on the battlefield? Do you need the extra cards? Do you need the extra damage? So one thing that's interesting about this card is it does pump your colorless creatures a lot. It reminds me of Forsaken Monument in the sense that it gives all your colorless creatures +3/+2. Obviously, that works with your manifest creatures, but that works with a lot of other things as well. I think the design of this is to work with like Eldrazi spawn tokens. We're getting a bunch of new ones with like Glimpse the Impossible in Modern Horizons 3 itself. So if you make a bunch of these like colorless spawn tokens, then you just play Kozilek and kind of like overrun and just make your team huge by surprise and kill your opponent. Works with artifacts like Wormcoil Engine, works with any disguise creatures, morph creatures, mega morph creatures, and I think that gives it some potential commander homes, where maybe you're playing like a Kadena morph deck and you're just gonna have a ton of face down colorless creatures. Maybe Kozilek's your finisher and you just like cast this to pump your team and win. Also works with like Merrill because it makes colorless soldiers. Anna Pikel makes colorless gnome artifacts, so you can just use your commander to snowball and make a ton of tokens, and then Kozilek to buff them and win the game with one big attack. So Kozilek, it's fine. It makes a big army. It just doesn't feel as flashy to me as a lot of other Eldrazi. It doesn't have that epic Eldrazi Titan feel. So I think it's a cool card. Not really expecting it to see modern play, but I don't know, it's only 9 mana. I know only, but for Eldrazi, 9 mana is pretty cheap, and it does add a lot of power to the battlefield. So maybe it's got to roll in some sort of Tron or Eldrazi Tron style deck. Worst case, it does seem good in colorless commander decks. We also got a new mythic elf warrior with the return of Eladamri. So new Eladamri, 3 mana 3/3, legendary elf warrior. It says you can look at the top card of your library at any time. You can cast creature spells from the top of your library, and then you can pay a green, tap it, and tap 2 untapped creatures you control. Reveal a card from your hand or the top of your library. If you reveal a creature card this way, put it on the battlefield, activate it only during your turn. So I gotta say, the way that ability is worded is kinda hilarious, because if you want to, you can just use it to flex, where you like tap a couple creatures, tap your Eladamri, pay the mana, and like reveal a farewell that you're gonna use to like kill your opponent's board the next turn. Maybe you reveal a lightning bolt that you're going to cast and kill your opponent with the following turn. So it's kind of funny that you could reveal anything with it, although obviously its main goal is going to be to put some massive creature into play. So if you think about what this is like an upgraded Vizier the Menagerie because it's cheaper, mixed with an upgraded Elvish Piper because it's also cheaper and it has a better body. And this card is designed to work in the elf deck. So elves in Modern already plays Realm Walker because it wants to be able to play creatures off the top of their deck. Elf decks are just so full of cheap creatures that being able to snowball off the top of your deck is really powerful. Eladamri is just way better Realm Walker. It's got better stats, it's got an extra ability. So I think this immediately replaces Realm Walker in elves, and then you get this huge upside. That last ability is really scary. In an elf deck, it's very possible that you can cast Eladamri on turn 2, and on turn 3 be activating its ability to put an Emrakul into play, a Crater Hoof Behemoth into play. Because remember, even though Eladamri itself needs to lose Summoning Sickness so you can tap it for its ability, the other 2 creatures you tap to its ability, they can be Summoning Sick. So you can like turn 1 Llanowar Elves, turn 2 Eladamri, turn 3, maybe cast another Llanowar Elves or something off the top of your deck, and then immediately just tap them, put a Craterhoof into play, put an Emrakul into play, win the game. This card is ridiculously explosive. If you want to go super duper deep, there's some shenanigans with Intruder Alarm where you like tap all your stuff, put a big thing into play, untap everything with Intruder Alarm, do it again. You just need a way to keep generating mana for Eladamri. So you need at least like one Llanowar Elves on the battlefield. But if you're untapping all your stuff every time a creature comes into play, you could theoretically use Eladamri to cast every creature in your deck, assuming you don't fizzle by hitting lands on the top of your deck, which you will do eventually, but you can cast all the cards off the top of your deck for free with this combo, which is kind of hilarious. Plus, we've been focused on elves, but you don't have to be an elf deck. Obviously, Eladamri, it seems designed for elves, but you could just be some generic cheat Emrakul into play style of deck that doesn't care about creature types at all. In Commander, I think this is an all-star in basically any elf deck. If you're playing Voja, or Lathril, or Zuri, or Marwyn, you name an elf commander, play Eladamri in that deck, it's gonna do work, because your elf deck gonna be super creature heavy, you're gonna have these big things you can cheat into play. I actually think there's an argument that Eladamri might be the best mono green elf commander. I like it more than Marwyn. Azori is pretty strong with the built-in overrun ability. It's gonna be less elf bally. Like Marwyn and Azori, pretty elf bally, where you're trying to play a bunch of little elves and go super wide. Eladamri has this twist where, yeah, you can still do that stuff, but you can also just be jamming massive things into play for free. So Eladamri, I think this card's really good. We'll see if it's enough to bring elves back in Modern. It certainly improves elves in Modern. Right now, elves are like kind of tier 3-ish and haven't been very good. They really have suffered from the Orcish Bowmaster meta because so many of their mana dorks just died to Bowmaster. But maybe Eladamri is the card that can bring them back with its power to just slam a massive finisher into play so quickly. We also got a super weird mythic. I don't know what they're doing with this one. Shadow of the Second Sun. So Shadow of the Second Sun, 6 mana enchantment. You enchant a player, and it says at the beginning of enchanted player's post-combat main phase, there's an additional beginning phase after this phase. So a beginning phase is an untap, upkeep, and draw step. So essentially, you do your thing in your pre-combat main phase. You go to combat. After combat, when you go to your second main phase, you get to untap all your stuff, lands included. You get to draw an extra card, and then I guess trigger any upkeep effects that you have on the battlefield. So Shadow of the Second Sun, it's a callback to Sphinx of the Second Sun, which is this big flying sphinx that essentially has the same ability. Never really saw play anywhere, although it's never been legal in Modern. I think the best comparison for Modern, if you want to squint really hard, and I don't have high hopes of this card actually working in Modern, but you can argue that it's kind of Wilderness Wreck, right? It's like 6 mana Wilderness Wreck, but it's a Wilderness Wreck that's also going to draw you an extra card every turn. You play this, you get to untap all your lands, do all your stuff from your pre-combat main phase, you draw an extra card, leave up all your counter spells or whatever that you need for your opponent to like just wreck them during their turn. So I can't see an argument for that. The problem I see with Shadow of the Second Sun is the meta's just built to handle it. There's Besaiju's everywhere, pick your poison, one of the most played sideboard cards. So I imagine a lot of times you're going to play this, maybe get one activation out of it, and then it's going to die. It is worth mentioning that it's kind of free once you get to 6 mana, because you get up to 6 mana, you play this pre-combat main phase, and then you untap all your mana during your post-combat main phase, so you're going to have your 6 mana back again. But I just am not sure this card is really going to make it in Modern. Where I think it will see play, and what I think the design of this card was for, is to be a sweet commander card, especially for suspend style decks. In the last like 6 months to a year, because of like Doctor Who and Universes Beyond, we've really seen Wizards put a lot of suspend commanders into the format, and I think this is supposed to be like an upgrade piece for your suspend deck, because your additional untap, upkeep, draw is going to be an additional counter off all your suspend stuff, so it's going to speed up the 10th Doctor, it's going to speed up your Joria. You can also play it with Braids to kind of break the symmetry, where you get multiple upkeeps to put things into play, your opponent only gets one. So I think that's the main purpose for this card. So it's a cool value-y design. Maybe the Wilderness Wreck, untapping all your lands things every turn can do something in Modern. I'm just skeptical because it's a 6 mana enchantment that dies to Besaiju and pick your poison, but it is a really neat design, and I also like the art. Our final mythic of the day, we have Arna, Kennerud, Skycaptain, and this card has some interesting history to it. So Arna's never had a magic card before, but it's been referenced in the flavor text of other cards almost 20 times, going all the way back to Ice Age. So technically it's been a character in Magic for like 30 years. We've just never really seen a card of it before. And I gotta say, even though the odds of this card seeing modern play are pretty low, this is one of my favorite designs of the entire day. So it's a 5 mana Esper 4/4. It's a legendary human knight. It is flying and lifelink, ward of discard a card, and then it says, whenever a modified creature you control attacks, so modified needs a counter or equipment, whenever a modified creature attacks, double the number of each kind of counter on it. Then for each non-token permanent attached to it, create a token that's a copy of that permanent attached to that creature. So I think this is designed to be one of the coolest commanders that Wizards has made in a long time. Start with a body. So for 5 mana, you essentially get an Aklazot's body, a 4/4 flying lifelinker, so pretty reasonable. Even better, it has the same ward as Graveyard Trespasser, not making it unkillable by any means, but your opponent's gonna have to think twice about killing it. They gotta discard a card that they probably don't want to do. So worst case, you get a 2-for-1 out of it if your opponent kills it. The exciting part about this card is if you can stick it in a modified deck, it does ridiculous things. So if you attack with a creature with a counter on it, like a Walking Ballista, you double the amount of counters on it. And worth pointing out here, it isn't when you attack with Arna, it's when you attack with a modified creature. So this means you can like get a modified creature down, play Arna, attack right away, double the counters on it. More exciting, it's going to double up any equipment or auras you have attached to that creature. So you got a Sword of Fire and Ice, you attack with the creature, now you have 2 Swords of Fire and Ice, and it even equips automatically. Maybe you got an Eldrazi conscription, now you got 2 Eldrazi conscriptions attached to the creature. So it's just such an incredibly cool build around card. So how do you build around this card? You could go full on auras. It works really well with auras, the ETB draw a card, stack up a bunch of angelic gifts, cartouches, runes, and then just like draw a huge amount of cards by copying every turn when you attack with your modified creature. You could go straight up Voltron and try to put all this stuff on Arna itself if you wanted to. Works really, really well with equipment. We talked about swords. There's so many swords in Magic. Works well with living weapons like Batter Skulls. We're able to just like double those up. You got Stoneforge to find your pieces. Plus, I was looking on EDH Rec, and there's not really an Esper +1/+1 counter commander. +1/+1 counters are one of the most popular themes in all of Commander, but Esper, right now, the only commander people really use is Rafine, and Rafine, like, kind of gets counters by conniving, so I can see why people use it as that, but it's never really had a straight-up great +1/+1 counter commander. A commander that can double the counters on your creatures every time they attack is ridiculous, so I feel like this card, yeah, maybe there's like some weird against the odds deck that we play where we're trying to like see how many swords we can get on one creature, or play it with boggles and see how many auras we can get on one creature. There is funny against the odds stuff we can do with it in Modern, but I think this card is really designed to be a super popular commander, and I expect when we look back on this set in like 6 months or a year, I would be surprised if Arna wasn't among the most popular commanders from the set. It wouldn't be a Modern Horizons set without a cycle of free spells, and we kind of already knew this was coming because we saw Flare Denial, Flare Cultivation a little while ago, but now we got the rest of the cycle, and this cycle is really interesting. So first, Modern Horizons, we got the Force cycle where you gotta pitch a card of the proper color from your hand to cast it for free. Then we got the disastrous Evoke Elementals that kind of just broke Modern for the last 2 years. Now we get the Flare cycle, so to cast Flares for free, you need to sack a non-token creature of the proper color, otherwise you can just play them for their mana cost. So these cards, we already talked about Flare Denial and Flare Cultivation, so we're going to focus on the other ones today, starting with Flare of Duplication. In Flare Duplication, pretty intriguing. So 3 mana instant. Of course, you can sack a non-token red permanent rather than pay its cost, and you get to copy an instant or sorcery and choose new targets for the copy. So essentially, you're getting a fork, except it can be a fork for free. So I think that Flare Duplication, I expect this card to see really heavy play in Commander for sure, but I think it might have some Modern implications. So one thing that Flare Duplication can do is let your mono red deck win a counter, or if your opponent counter spells your thing, you can Flare of Duplication the counter spell and redirect it to something else so it's not countering your spell. So that's one of the uses, is like a mono red win a counter war effect. And plus red has a bunch of cheap creatures. That's what you really look for, I think, with these flares is, am I going to have a cheap sacrificable creature on the battlefield? Paying 3 mana for a a fork, not the end of the world, it's not great, but if you're red, you got Ragavans, Dragon Rage Channelers, not that you want to be sacking these, but in a pinch, sacrificing them to fizzle your opponent's big turn is totally going to be worth it. Obviously, the dream with this card, and I don't know what deck in Modern is really going to do this to you, but the dream is your opponent's like, all right, I'm going to Banefire for 20 your face for lethal, and you're like, all right, sure, Flare Duplication, sack my thing, I will copy your Banefire, and I will redirect it at your face. My copy is going to resolve first, so you're going to die before your Banefire resolves. So I think that's like the dream. That's what you want to do with this card. Like I said, I was like trying to think of a Modern deck that won this way. I don't think there really is one, at least out of tier decks, but it's something to keep in mind for sure. So I think Flare Duplication could be a Modern sideboard card. Worst case, worst case, I think it's going to see a lot of CDH play. Also worth mentioning, you can copy your own effects if you want to, so maybe there's some sort of combo where you can use this, sack a creature, copy your own ritual or something to have this big storm style combo turn. We also got Flare of Fortitude, which is kind of an absurd card. 4 mana instant, you can sack a white non-token creature rather than pay its cost, and it says until end of turn, your life total can't change. In permanence you control, gain hexproof and indestructible. So this is almost a free Teferi's Protection. Teferi's Protection, a little bit better, right? Because it phases your stuff out. Flare of Fortitude, even giving your creatures hexproof and indestructible, if your opponent has a Farewell, let's say, you're still kind of going to get got. Otherwise, this does almost what Teferi's Protection does, but you can do it for free by sacrificing a non-token white creature. So what this does in Modern, I guess it's going to be to like fizzle combo turns. Your opponent like has their big Primeval Titan Valakut turn, and you're like, all right, Flare of Fortitude, I'm not going to die this turn. My life total can't change. And then hopefully you can win on the backswing, or maybe some big Prowess turn, a big Colossus Hammer attack. So it's kind of like this super fog that can also potentially protect your team, right? You can use it to fizzle a Supreme Verdict or something, fizzle a Brothers at end that's going to wipe away your creatures by giving your creatures indestructible until end of turn. So I think this does have uses in specific situations. I don't know if it's a main deck card, but I could certainly see it seeing sideboard play. And white's another color that just has a lot of cheap creatures, your Esper Sentinels, Martyrzans, Giver of Runes. So the decks that could play this probably going to have something to sacrifice, because 4 mana is kind of a lot for the effect, but when you're doing this for free and your opponent doesn't see it coming and you get them by surprise, it is one of those cards that can just swing the game in your favor. Also think this is an ultra staple in Commander. Like, Teferi's Protection is a card that if you were in white, you should play. Flare of Fortitude, not quite like that, because you really want to be able to free cast it, although honestly in Commander, 4 mana for this effect is probably okay. Like, people play Teferi's Pro and it's only 1 mana less, and that's a true staple. But assuming you're a deck that has some white creatures, so sometimes you can cast this for free, I don't see any reason why, if you're trying to build your deck as optimally or as powerfully as possible, you wouldn't run this in basically every single deck. We also got Flare of Malice. Flare of Malice, pretty easy one. So Flare of Malice is 4 mana, except you can cast it for free by sacking a black creature, and it says each opponent sacks a creature or planeswalker with the greatest mana value among creatures you control. This is essentially Soul Shatter, except you can cast it for free sometimes, and that does have a lot of power. If you go back to the, like, my opponent hasten a Primeval Titan or something, and they're going to try to kill me with it, being able to free cast while you're tapped out this by sacrificing something is a nice way to keep yourself alive. And black might be the best color for sacrificing, because that's kind of what black does. In a black deck, you might actually want to be sacrificing stuff. It's a way to, like, kill your Stitcher Supplier to mill some more cards, or trigger your Blood Artist, or cast your Gravecrawler from the graveyard again. So there's plenty of things that you can sack in a black deck. So I think Flare of Malice, if you're a deck that has these cheap sacrificable black cards, I think this card's just really, really good. Like, even if you're casting this on turn 1, sacking your Stitcher Supplier to kill a Ragavan, you're going to be happy with that. And because it has the restriction that your opponent has to sack their most expensive thing, it gets around the big problem with edicts, which is opponents are going to sacrifice, you know, their random token or whatever, their least impactful threat, but that's not going to be an option with Flare of Malice. So I think Flare of Malice certainly has Modern potential, and again is another card that probably sees some Commander play. I know Crim really, really big on edicts in Commander, but this one even I like, and I'm not really an edict fan, just because you know you're not just going to get your opponent's best thing, you're going to get each opponent's best thing, and it can be a sack outlet in a pinch. Next up, we got just 6. Before it met Ren and we got Ren in 6, this is OG 6. So a 3-mana 2/4 legendary tree folk. It has reach, so it can block flyers, which is kind of a nice upside. It says when it attacks, you mill 3 cards, can put a land card from among them into your hand, and then as long as it's your turn, non-land permanence cards in your graveyard have retrace, so you can cast permanents from your graveyard by discarding a card along with paying their cost. And I think 6 is actually a pretty exciting card. So if you think about this, it really is a lot like Ren in 6, except in creature form. Like, when you attack with it, you get a land back to your hand, so it kind of does the same thing as Ren's +1, and then it kind of has Ren in 6's ultimate, except for permanence, except you don't need to wait a bunch of turns of plussing to get there. Like, it just does it right away. As soon as this hits the battlefield, you can start casting your non-land permanent cards from your graveyard, as long as you can discard a land, and it kind of snowballs with itself. If you can attack, you get lands in your hand that then you can discard to cast other things from your graveyard. So I think this card is actually very, very strong. My first thought was really good for Life from the Loam decks. We've seen some Assault Loam decks where you're trying to use Life from the Loam to get a ton of lands into your hand and then discard them all to Seismic Assault to kill your opponent. 6 seems perfect for that deck. It's another way to get cards back in your hand. It's got a 2/4 body, so it can block and slow down the game while you're getting things set up. And then if your opponent has a way to answer your Seismic Assault, they Besage you it, or pick your poison it or whatever, you can just use 6 to cast it from your graveyard. And in a Life from the Loam deck that's always going to have a ton of lands in your hand, you're going to be able to cast whatever non-land permanents you want from your graveyard, as long as you have 6, because you're always going to have enough fuel for retrace. It also seems intriguing as like a one-of in Yogg, maybe, where this is a way that you can just get back your combo pieces from your graveyard. As a one-of, you can Court a Calling it when you need it. Maybe your opponent killed or countered your Yogg, and then you just use 6 to cast it again, get it back, combo off. Cheap enough to work with Collected Company, which is relevant to some decks. And there's also some infinite combo potential. I think this is more like Commander Infinite combo, but it works really well with the Gitrog monster. So Gitrog monster, when a land goes to the graveyard, you get to draw a card. So what you can do is you can get the Lotus Petal on the battlefield, sack it for a mana, you can Dack more Salvage, discard it to 6 to be able to cast the Lotus Petal again with retrace. That'll trigger the Gitrog monster. So when you trigger Gitrog monster, instead of just drawing a card, you just dredge Dack more Salvage back to your hand, and then you can repeat the loop. You sack the Lotus Petal, get another mana, then you can discard the Dack more Salvage to be able to cast the Lotus Petal from the graveyard thanks to 6's ability, which will trigger Gitrog to dredge back the Dack more Salvage again and again and again. Basically infinite mana from Lotus Petal, and also dredge through your entire deck, or as much of it as you want. So that seems pretty fun as well. So 6, I think this card's kind of good. Like, yes, you need to be in a specific deck, I think. I don't think just a generic mono green deck or something would play it. But if you have graveyard synergies, the ability to get lands back from your hand, and then also eventually cast your permanents from your hand, offers a lot of value as long as this card sticks on the battlefield. We also got Genku Future Shaper. In this one, when I first saw it, I was like, alright, I don't think this can do anything in Modern. But then I thought a little more about it, and now I'm like, well, I don't think it can do anything in Modern, but maybe. So it's a 4-mana 2/5. It's a legendary Moonfolk wizard. It says, when another non-token permanent you control leaves the battlefield, choose one that hasn't been chosen this turn, and create a creature token with those characteristics. So when a non-token permanent leaves the battlefield, you can make a 2/2 white fox with vigilance, a 1/2 blue Moonfolk with flying, or a 1/1 black rat with lifelink, and then you pay 5 mana to put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. So when I first saw this, I was like, all right, it's a commander card, right? Like, you play it as your commander and you have all these cute little animals and it's kind of fun. I think it's supposed to, like, maybe call ahead to Bloomburrow in some ways with all the cute animal tokens. I don't know, also calls back to Kamigawa. So I thought, it's kind of a cute commander card. But then I realized it does work with fetch lands, and I don't know if this is enough to really matter. But, like, you could play this and immediately play and crack a fetch and make a 2/2 fox with vigilance, or, make a 1/2 flying Moonfolk, which is kind of cute. It also works really well with blink effects. So maybe you're playing, like, an ephemerate deck, a soul herder deck. So you ephemerate something, and then kind of as a bonus kicker, you get a fox or a Moonfolk or a rat, and the next time you do it, you get another one. You can be making up to 3 tokens each turn for free just by, like, blinking stuff and cracking fetch lands. Also worth mentioning, it is a blue and a white card, which is relevant for pitching to Subtleties and Solitude. It's funny that that's part of how you gotta evaluate cards in Modern, but it is an upside to be blue and white because that pitches to 2 different colors of Evoke Elementals. I think what I like most about this card in its primary home is probably going to be, it's like a fun Blink token commander. So I love Blink decks in Commander, but I've kind of moved away from playing them because a lot of times they just like dirtle around and you have these super long turns as all your opponents are looking sad as you're like doing all these fun things and they're doing nothing. I like that Genku, I don't think it's going to be nearly as degenerate as Brago or Rune. Like, it's a much safer deck, and I also like that it throws this token sub-theme into the deck, which means not only are you doing Blink shenanigans, but you're also building a board that's going to eventually kill your opponents, and you can throw in like anointed processions and so forth to like speed up the process. So I think it's actually like kind of a pretty cool build around Commander. It's also worth mentioning that it's worded this turn, so that means you can take and make 3 tokens every turn cycle in Commander if you have enough Blink effects. So you can make 3 during your turn, 3 during your next opponent's turn, assuming you have ways to have permanents be leaving the battlefield, which is kind of a ridiculously big army. So Genku, I would be surprised if it made it in Modern. It's 4 mana for a 2/5. It doesn't really do anything right away. If you want to do something right away, you got to get up to 5 mana and be able to like play and crack a fetch the turn that you play it. So I'd be surprised if it really made it in Modern, but it is a really cute card and it can do some fun things. We also got Pearl Ear Imperial Advisor. So a 3 mana 3/4 legendary Fox Advisor. It has lifelink. It says enchantment spells that you cast have affinity for auras. So they cost 1 less to cast for each aura you control, and then when you cast an aura spell that targets a modified permanent you control, so something that is equipped, has an aura on it or a counter on it, you get to draw a card. So I think the idea of this card is to maybe bring back Boggles in Modern. Boggles used to be a really big archetype. It's really fallen off though, and we haven't seen it much in a while, but Pearl Ear seems designed to work in Boggles. You're going to put auras on your creatures, and then your auras are going to draw you more cards because your creatures will be modified, and then you can even ramp into your auras. The awkward part about Pearl Ear and Boggles is they usually play a lot of 1 mana auras, so I don't know what the ramp, the affinity mode, is really going to do. I guess you could go like full on against the odds mode and be like, hey, here's a free Eldrazi conscription as I churn through my deck, which sounds like something I would do. I don't know if that'd be a competitive thing, but it does sound kind of hilarious that if you cast enough Rankers and Ethereal Armors, eventually you're going to draw into your Eldrazi's conscription and just like cast these huge annihilating auras to win the game. So we'll see if this is enough to really bring back Boggles in the format. Part of the problem with Boggles is they actually ended up cutting Core Spirit Dancer, which was like the main engine of the deck, because drawing cards is super risky in an Orcish Bowmaster format. And Pearl Ear kind of has the same problem. Like, if every time you cast an aura, you have to draw a card, that's your Bowmaster's triggering a lot of times each turn, and your opponent making this huge Orc army and pinging your face a bunch. But maybe Pearl Ear just doesn't care. Like, maybe you can just cast so many auras and make such a big lifelinking Pearl Ear that if you just Voltron up Pearl Ear, yeah, your opponent's going to make this really massive, a mass Orc token, but you're going to have like a 20 powered lifelinking Pearl Ear, so you just take all the Bowmaster triggers and then smash your opponent with this one huge lifelinking, maybe trampling with Ranker attack to close out the game. The other thing worth mentioning about this card is it does work with any auras, and it works with any enchantment, so it's kind of a cute curse card where Overwhelming Splendor, Cruel Reality, those are technically auras, so those are going to work with the affinity cost, and you could even try to like get a bunch of auras on things and then cast an Omniscience for like 2 mana or something, get the cost down on these really big enchantments. So maybe there's some like janky combo where you're just trying to get a bunch of auras on the battlefield to use this as like a ramp spell. If there's one thing we know about affinity is historically it has been pretty broken. So even though affinity for auras with enchantments only seems like a pretty safe way to do affinity, you never know, because affinity has been pretty busted in the past. So Pearl Ear, I'm excited to give it a shot in Modern Boggles. Worst case, seems like a fun way to get someone with Eldrazi conscription. We also got Thief of Existence. So Thief of Existence, 3 mana, including a green mana and an actual colorless mana for a 3/4 Eldrazi with Devoid. So even though it's green, it's technically colorless. It says when you cast this, exile up to 1 target non-creature, non-land permanent an opponent controls with mana value 4 or less. If you do, it gains. When it leaves the battlefield, target opponent draws a card. So Thief of Existence, this card actually really intrigues me. A 3 mana 3/4 is a decent body. It has Devoid, which doesn't really matter, but it has a mechanic. The most exciting part is this actually snipes a lot of relevant cards in Modern. Wizards, during their spoiler stream, talked about how they kind of designed this to hate on Teferi Time Raveler. That was kind of like the main goal. But when you think about Modern, there's a lot of non-creature, non-land permanents with mana value 4 or less that you need to get rid of. Along with Teferi, there's Wrenn 6, and then there's hate cards, Chalice of the Void, Rest in Peace, Pithing Needle. Depending on what deck you're playing, these are some of the silver bullet hate cards that might just take your deck out of the game altogether. Thief of Existence seems like a nice catch-all. The only question is, are you going to be able to cast it? Remember, you have to have literal colorless mana to even cast this card, which is a cost. Like, if you look at a typical modern mana base, most modern decks can't make colorless mana. They're all fetch lands, shock lands, surveil lands, some basic lands. So most modern decks don't actually have a way to cast this card. But if your deck can cast this, and you're worried about Teferi, or some sort of non-creature hate spell like a Chalice of the Void or Rest in Peace, this is a really good answer. And then you get like an endurance-sized body on the battlefield, which isn't like a bomb or super above the curve by 2024 standards, but it's still a pretty reasonable effect on the battlefield as well. So one of the sub-themes for Modern Horizons 3 seems to be iconic reserve list cards coming back, but with energy attached to them. So the blue member of this, what I assume is a cycle, is Volatile Stormdrake. So Volatile Stormdrake, 2 mana 3/2, it's a Drake, it's a blue creature, it is flying and hexproof from activated and triggered abilities. And then it says, when it enters the battlefield, exchange control of it and target creature an opponent controls. If you do, you get 4 energy, then sack the creature you stole unless you pay an amount of energy equal to its mana value. So Volatile Stormdrake, it's essentially Gilded Drake, the energy version. Gilded Drake is a card that doesn't see a ton of play outside of CDH. It used to see some legacy play, but it's also like $300 because it's on the reserve list. Volatile Stormdrake does the same exact thing, except it's got the twist of needing to pay some energy. Gilded Drake, you can just steal anything. The way it used to see play in Legacy is your opponent would show and tell, and they'd put an Emrakul into play, and then you'd put the Gilded Drake into play and just steal the Emrakul and give your opponent the Gilded Drake and be like, good game. Volatile Stormdrake doesn't exactly do that unless you have a huge amount of energy. If you do it, which you can do, you can steal the Emrakul, but then you're gonna have to sack the Emrakul unless you can pay 15 energy. So Volatile Stormdrake is better at stealing smaller creatures, I guess, unless you're a dedicated energy deck. If you have an unlimited amount of energy, then you can use it essentially just like a Gilded Drake. I think as far as this card seeing play, I'm not really sure what it does in Modern. Like, I guess you can steal an Archon of Cruelty or something, like, I don't make your opponent sack it. It's like a weird blue removal spell, kind of like a Resculpt or a Pongify, where you're like answering the thing but giving your opponent a 3/2 flyer in return. I don't know if that's really enough. I think it's a card to keep in mind. There could be specific metas where this becomes a really important card. If we ever have like actual show and tell in Modern and people are just show and telling Emrakuls or whatever, if we end up in that place, it could be good. I don't think we're there right now. Where I do think this card will see play is in CDH, either as an additional Gilded Drake or as a budget Gilded Drake if you can't afford the $300 actual reserve list Gilded Drake. And in CDH, it kind of does a couple of things. So for one thing, you can use it to get rid of asymmetrical stacks pieces. Like your opponent has a Drannith Magistrate. This is your opponent can't cast spells from anywhere except their hand, locking your commander out of the game. You can Volatile Stormdrake, give your opponent the Stormdrake, and commander, you're at 40 life. What do you care if your opponent has a 3/2 flyer? Doesn't matter at all. You take the Drannith Magistrate. Now you can cast your commander, and your opponents aren't going to be able to cast their commander. It's also an interesting way to answer commanders. Maybe you're worried about your opponent popping off the next turn with Kinnan or something. You can Stormdrake, steal your opponent's Kinnan. It's not going back to the command zone. It's going to your side of the battlefield, so your opponent can't just immediately recast it, and your opponent ends up with the Stormdrake. So I think this is a pretty intriguing commander card, even if it is kind of Pongify or Resculpt-ish. I don't know what it does in Modern. The best I can come up with is like you Ether Violet in and try to like steal a Primeval Titan before it kills you, or disrupt some creature-based combo like Devoted Druid combo. Seems like kind of a stretch, but I am glad it exists. The other thing to keep in mind in this card that we haven't really talked about much is energy is one of the big mechanics in Modern Horizons 3, and if there's an energy deck, this card starts to look a lot better because you can just put this into play, steal one of your opponent's creatures, give your opponent the Drake, sack the creature, and end up getting 4 energy for 2 mana, which if you're trying to like chain together Chthonian Nightmares or combo off with Aetherworks Marvel, maybe just like 2 mana, get 4 energy, give you a 3/2, it's gonna be enough as like this weird energy ritual essentially, with the additional upside that there might be some situations where you actually just like straight up steal your opponent's best creature and leave him with a little Drake. So Volatile Stormdrake, love the callback to Gilded Drake. Think it has a lot of commander implications, some energy implications in Modern, and it's just a card that I'm glad exists on Magic Arena for Timeless, for Historic, for Modern in paper, because we just don't really have a Gilded Drake style effect. So even though I'm not sure it does anything in our current meta in Modern or Timeless or whatever, I'm glad it exists because I bet there will be a time at some point in the future where we're like, my goodness, I'm really thankful I got Volatile Stormdrake because it is disrupting this really devastating tier 1 combo deck. We also got, speaking of energy versions of reserve list cards, Wheel of Potential. So Wheel of Potential, 3 mana red sorcery, you get 3 energy. Then you can pay X energy. Each player may exile their hand and destroy X cards. If X is 7 or more, you may play cards you own exiled this way until your next turn. So this one, you probably know the callback. It's Wheel of Fortune, also with the upside that if you pay some energy, you can kind of Invasion of Keldheim it, where not only you get the wheel effect, but you also get to play the cards that you wheeled away until the next turn. There is some drawbacks here, right? Like you exile your hand. So Wheel of Potential is not going to fill your graveyard, which is one of the purposes of Wheel of Fortune. I also think it's intriguing how they formatted this card. Each player may exile their hand. One thing I've complained about a lot is the combo with wheels play pattern. I think that wheels are great cards, but there are certain combo pieces, and I think Wizards finally, because of Orcish Bowmasters and Shieldred, decided they needed to fix this issue. So Wheel of Potential would be really, really devastating in Modern if it forced your opponent to discard their hand and draw 7 cards, because that would mean your Bowmasters is triggering 7 times, your Shieldred is triggering 7 times, you're probably just winning the game on the spot. But because it's a May ability, your opponent gets to choose. If you get a Bowmasters, if you have a Shieldred, they're just like, all right, you wheel your stuff, I'm not going to draw any cards, that's fine. And this is even more relevant to Commander, where in Commander, you got Notion Thief, you got Narset Parter Veils, you used to have Hull Breacher, and I really, really hate the play pattern of like, Notion Thief, wheel, everyone else has no hands, I have a million cards. And this really solves it. So even though I don't think Wheel of Potential has that much potential, I do really, really like that Wizards found a formatting for this card that allows it to do its job of being a wheel without just being a really annoying combo piece with Narset and Notion Thief. The reason I'm not like higher on this card, for one thing, in Modern, I don't think you can play this card because of Bowmasters. Yeah, sure, I guess you can choose not to do it if your opponent flashes into Bowmasters in response, but it still seems pretty bad. I just don't think you can play a wheel in Modern right now because of the Orcish Bowmasters. In Commander, Wheel of Fortune used to be one of my most played cards. I would play in every single red deck, but this was like a decade ago. And over the past decade, we've just gotten so much more card advantage that I don't actually really play Wheel anymore. I just don't feel like I need it because we have other ways to generate card advantage. So like a decade ago, I would have been all about this card is like a non-reserve list, way cheaper budget Wheel of Fortune. But as it is, especially since it exiles the cards rather than filling your graveyard, I'm kind of like, I don't know. I don't even know if I'd really play this in Commander. It is really cool in energy decks, though. If you can, like, double wheel with this, where you get to use your last hand that you exile and get a new hand, that's actually a lot of card advantage. So, another super sweet reserve list callback. Just how impactful it's going to be immediately, we'll have to wait and see. But I really like this new formatting on wheels that keeps them from comboing with stuff like Notion Thief. Next up today, we have one of the biggest Modern cards from the day in White Orchid Phantom. So White Orchid Phantom, 2 white mana for a 2/2. It's a creature Spirit Knight. It has flying and first strike. And it says when it enters the battlefield, destroy up to 1 target non-basic land. Its controller may search their library for a basic land, put it on the battlefield tapped, and shuffle. So why is this card so exciting? Well, first off, it's actually got like pretty interesting stats. It's like a Field of Ruin attached to a Thunder Spirit. If you don't know the story of Thunder Spirit is a 3-mana 2/2 flying first striker from way back in 1994. For some reason that no one really understands, it ended up on the reserve list. So Wizards can't print a 3-mana 2/2 flying first striker, which today would literally be a random common. Like, it would be a draft common that wasn't even that good. It would be like an okay draft common, but they just can't print it because of the reserve list. So White Orchid Phantom is kind of like a power crept Thunder Spirit. You cut a mana off its cost, and you add a Field of Ruin to to it. The reason its ability is so exciting is it really does double duty. So on one hand, this is a great way to disrupt your opponent's powerful non-basic lands. If your opponent's assembling Tron, this just blows up a Tron piece. And at 2 mana, it's going to be fast enough to disrupt Tron, even if you're on the draw, which is a problem with Blood Moon that you run into. If you're on the draw with the Blood Moon deck, your opponent might have their Karn on the battlefield because they assembled Tron before you can even play the Blood Moon. So it's going to be fast enough on the player on the draw. It gets Urza Saga, it's Coffers, it gets Nykthos. Name a powerful utility non-basic land. This is a 2 mana answer to it that leaves behind a pretty sweet 2/2 flying first strike body. The other reason this card's exciting is it's also ramp for your deck. We used to see this a lot with Cleansing Wildfire, where if you use a white Orchid Phantom on an indestructible land like Cascading Cataracts, Razortide Bridge, the land is going to be destroyed, but it doesn't actually go away because it's indestructible, and you still get to tutor out a land. We also have in white Flagstones of Torkir, which when it goes to the graveyard, you get to tutor up a plains. So this is a card that disrupts your opponent's non-basics, and also, like Cleansing Wildfire, can actually ramp you if you're willing to build around it. I think it with double white works really well with Nykthos, so it could show up in some sort of like mono white devotion deck where you also like find a way to fit Flagstones in there as a backup ramp plan and just ramp into big things. There was this deck, and I want to bring this back once we get Modern Horizons 3. There was a boom bust deck that was using Cleansing Wildfire and indestructible lands as ramp, and plus, since you're playing indestructible lands, you could cast Bust, the destroy all land side of boom bust, and not really care because your lands were indestructible. White Orchid Phantom seems like a way upgraded version of it. It does what Cleansing Wildfire does, except it gives you a body that shuts down a Ragavan. It gives you pressure in the early game to get after your opponent's Planeswalkers, and then it also just ramps into 4 mana things really well if you have the indestructible land, so it ramps you into Chandra or Nahiri to get an Emrakul eventually. So that's a deck that I'm really excited to see getting more support. It also seems really good in Death and Taxes style decks. In Death and Taxes, this card becomes kinda busted because you can like get a Leonin Arbiter into play to make it so your opponent can't search their library, and then White Orchid Phantom blow up your opponent's land and they can't even get a replacement. When this is blowing up the land and your opponent doesn't get a replacement, it's like a sinkhole that leaves behind a 2/2 flying first strike body, which is absolutely ridiculous. So White Orchid Phantom, I am really high on this card. I think this card is going to see play to disrupt your opponent. It's going to see play to ramp you. It's got a bunch of different homes. It is just a really, really oddly powerful effect. Speaking of neat callbacks, we got Powerbalance. So Powerbalance, a double red enchantment that says whenever an opponent casts a spell, you can reveal the top card of your library. If you do, you may cast the card without paying its mana cost if the 2 spells have the same mana value. So what this essentially means is if your opponent casts a 2-drop and you got a 2-drop on the top of your deck, you get to play it for free. If your opponent casts a 10-drop and you got a 10 on top of your deck, you get to play it for free. So this calls back to Counterbalance, which was the blue version of this effect, but instead of being able to let you cast things for free, it would just counter things if it had the proper mana value. Is Powerbalance going to be good? And my question for this card is, I just don't know if we have the support in Modern. If you look at Counterbalance, the way it was mostly played was with the help of things like Sensei's Divining Top, Brainstorm, Scroll Whack, ways to know what's on top of your deck, where you're able to like see what your opponent casts, and then with the Powerbalance trigger on the stack, manipulate the top of your deck to make sure that it hits. If you're just playing it in the dark and just hoping beyond hope that you have the same mana values, I don't think it's actually going to be all that consistent. So that would be my main concern for this, is I'm just not sure we have the support pieces in Modern to make it work. But there is a dream where this card could be really busted. Like, if you're playing Modern, a lot of decks are going to be really low to the curve. There's some decks that are playing pretty much all 1 and 2 mana value things. In a mirror like that, where you're also playing a deck that's all 1 and 2 mana value things, maybe Powerbalance could just be good enough on its own, where you just cast it and you're like, hopefully I got a 1 on top when my opponent plays a 1 and I get 1 for free. You Ragavan and then I Thoughtseize you. You Dragon Rage Channeler and then I Fatal Push you for free. Whether or not this will actually work, the consistency issue is there, but if you can set it up somehow, it does get really, really interesting. Obviously the dream is, and I don't know how to ever make this happen, but I really want my opponent to cast an Emrakul, and I have an Emrakul on the top of my deck, so I get to cast mine for free and annihilate my opponent first. I don't know what world that'll ever happen in, but my god, would it be funny if it ever did. So Powerbalance, If you have the right support cards to manipulate the top of your deck, I think this card can be very powerful. I think it could see play in Commander for sure, and I think it would even have a chance in formats like Modern if there was the support for it. I'm actually most intrigued to try this card maybe in Timeless, where you have Brainstorm. Legacy, unfortunately, they banned Sensei's Divining Top, which, well, maybe not unfortunately. That card is really miserable when it comes to tournament play, but there's just not a lot of support pieces for it. So if you got some ideas of how to manipulate this, to make sure you're hitting, definitely let me know, because the card is super cool. One of the most unique and sweet designs from the set. I just don't know if you can play it fairly. If you're just casting this and hoping things line up, I think you're going to whiff way too much to make it be worth it. But on the other hand, I mean, how many times do you really need to hit with this to make it worth 2 mana? 2, 3, 4? So maybe there is some world where in the right matchup, you can just kind of slam it and hope for the best. We also got Detective's Phoenix. So Detective's Phoenix, this card is pretty intriguing. 3 mana 2/2. It has Flying and Haste, and also has Bestow of 1 red mana and collect 6 evidence. And you can put it on a creature for its bestow cost, and it'll give that creature +2/+2 flying and haste, and you can cast it from your graveyard using the bestow ability. So Detective's Phoenix is a card that I don't think you really ever want to cast. Like a 3 mana 2/2 haster, that's not going to be good enough for Modern. I'm very intrigued by the idea, though, of playing this in some sort of dredge yourself mill deck, where you're able to just mill this into your graveyard, and then you get a big finisher like, I don't know, the best I could come up with was Splinter Fright, which gets a ton of power based on the number of creatures in your graveyard, but you get some big finisher, and then you use Detective's Phoenix for 1 red mana to bestow it and give it haste, and just one-shot your opponent on the spot. So I think that could have some potential. Maybe in a less janky world, what about something like Isn't Murktide? You got like Dragon Rage Channeler that can surveil cards in the graveyard. You got Ledger Shredder that can discard cards from your hand and get them in the graveyard. So as long as you can get this and some other stuff for collecting evidence into the graveyard, it seems really good. For 1 red mana, all of a sudden your Ragavan is a 4/3 flying haster, stealing your opponent's stuff. Your Murktide coming down with haste probably just kills your opponent on the spot. So I actually think Detective's Phoenix is a card that has a bunch of uses, and I think this card will see play in Modern. And the more I think about this card and what it can do, the more I become convinced that this is like stealthily the best bestow card that's ever been made, and might actually be one of the stronger rares that we've seen from the set so far. When I first thought, I was like, oh, whatever, random draft chaff, but I actually think 1 mana repeatable haste from the graveyard, someone's got to be able to make use of that. It's just a really powerful effect. Moving into the world of reprints, we got a bunch of them to go through. We're going to try to keep it short since all these are existing cards. First off, we have this special guest slot. So these are 10 cards with new arts, all reprints, most notably going to be new to Magic Arena for the first time. So it's all 5 of the Evoke Elementals, Prismatic Ending, Dismember, Persist, Thought Not Seer, and then Expressive Iteration that's already on Arena. And I gotta say, these 10 cards are going to shake up Timeless. They're going to shake up Historic. I am legitimately scared at what these cards are going to do. Obviously, Prismatic Ending, Dismember, good removal, Persist, joining Reanimate to give you multiple good reanimation effects, Thought Not Seer to help with Eldrazi, but the big ones, of course, are the Evoke Elementals, and I might need y'all to talk me down off the ledge a little bit. I've been thinking about this for a couple of days now, and how in the world is Scam not going to be the best deck in Timeless once these cards drop on Magic Arena? How? How is it possible that Rakdos Scam is just not the best thing going? You can essentially build very close to pre-Fury banning Modern Rakdos Scam, a deck that was so good it got banned out of Modern and is still the most played deck in Modern after getting its key card banned because Scamming Grief is so powerful. How is this not just going to dominate Timeless to an unprecedented extent? Like, if you think about it right now, what do you got? Show and Tell? Yeah, Show and Tell's great. Like, do a big thing on turn 3. You know what beats Show and Tell? Stripping your opponent's hand with triple Thoughtseize on turn 1. So I'm very curious how this is going to play out. I am excited about these cards. Outside of like the Scam plan, I'm actually excited about all these cards, and I think they're going to be really good additions to Arena, but I am legitimately fearful that Scam is just going to absolutely take over the Timeless meta. So some really exciting reprints, really cool art. We also found out there's an old border or retro border reprint slot in collector boosters. So these cards, since they're collector booster only, I don't think they're going to be coming to Magic Arena, at least not necessarily coming to Magic Arena, but they're nice value if you're opening some packs. Seeing Ragavan in there, as much as I hate that card, it is really expensive, and getting an old border one probably going to be really popular. So just a nice way to add a bit more value to collector boosters. We also got Commander Icon Breya Ethereum Shaper coming to Modern for the first time. It's hard for me to imagine Breya really taking off in Modern. It's 4 colors. It is powerful on the battlefield as a 4/4 that makes some Thopters, and you can sack artifacts for value. But 4 colors is kind of a big ask when you could just like slam an Urza for 4 mana in a mono blue deck. So I don't know. I guess there's some reprint value here where it's like a $5 card, but I'm imagining this was kind of to give Commander players like a new fancy printing of Breya for their Commander deck rather than designed to shake up Modern. We also got, speaking of iconic commanders coming to Modern for the first time, Kaalia of the Vast. So Kaalia of the Vast, if you don't know it, 4 mana 2/2 flying. When it attacks, you put an Angel, Demon, or Dragon from your hand on the battlefield, tapped and attacking. This is a card that I don't think is going to see competitive Modern play. I mean, it is a 4 mana 2/2, but I could imagine a world where you just like haste this in with something like Hall the Bandit Lord, maybe on turn 3 if you can get some ramp going, and you stick a, I don't know, Grizzlebrand or Dragon Lord Atarka or Angel of Despair, some massive thing. And remember, the creature sticks around. This isn't like a sneak attack where it's going to go away on your end step. So if you pull this off, you probably win the game. Like, it doesn't take many turns with a Grizzlebrand or a Dragonlord Atarka to just close out the game. So we'll have to wait and see. I'm definitely planning on trying to build Kaalia in Modern as like an against the odds deck. Whether or not it actually works, my guess is probably not as far as like a competitive tier archetype. There's just so much removal in Modern now. You're going to get solituded or whatever, but it is a cool build around. So I'm excited to be able to give it a try in Modern. We also got, speaking of Commander cards, the Medallion cycle being reprinted. So the Medallion cycle, a fairly popular ramp for monocolored Commander decks. Not only are we getting the normal ones, we're getting these special frame break treatments that do look really good. Look at that Jet Medallion in the bottom. What is going on with that person's face? I don't even want to know. It kind of looks like they pulled their own eyeball out, but I'm not going to think about that. As far as Modern is concerned, there have been legacy decks that have played Ruby Medallion. There was like a mono red Ruby Medallion Storm deck at one point. I think I've seen Sapphire Medallion decks like in the distant past. I don't know. My guess is they don't really see Modern play, and this is kind of a Commander reprint. Maybe if there's some sort of Storm style combo deck, maybe that changes the equation. But otherwise, good value reprints, get some sweet new art. Speaking of Modern, we do have a reprint that I think is going to shake up the format a bit in Deserted Temple. So Deserted Temple, it's a land that you can tap to add a colorless mana, or pay 1 and tap it to untap target land. Why would you want to untap a land? It works really well with Cabal Coffers and also Nykthos. So I expect that Deserted Temple probably shows up in the mono black Coffers deck at a minimum. You don't play 4 copies of them. You probably play 1 or 2 copies and try to tutor them up. But when you have a land like Cabal Coffers that can tap to make 5, 6, 7, 8 mana, being able to untap it for essentially 2 mana, because you got to tap the Deserted Temple as well, really, really powerful. You're just generating a huge amount of mana. Same is true of Nykthos, and this is probably more of like a timeless thing or a historic thing. But in those formats, I love playing like mono black Devotion. Mono green Devotion's been popular. And I think Deserted Temple will definitely see play there for the same trick as Cabal Coffers, where when your Nykthos tapping for like 10 and then you can untap it for just 2 mana, it is a ridiculously good deal. So Deserted Temple, I think it's definitely going to serve a purpose. Only specific decks are going to want it, but in those decks, the card's really, really strong. We also got Kaalia, Son of Yawgmoth, coming to Modern for the first time. Kaalia, 7 mana, except it's kind of 4 mana, and 3 black Phyrexian mana for a 2/2. It has lifelink, and it says for each black mana in a cost, you can pay 2 life rather than pay that mana, and then whenever you cast a back spell, you get to put a +1/+1 counter on Kaalia, Son of Yawgmoth. This is one I've been going back and forth on. It is a lot of mana or a lot of life. Remember, in Commander, you start in 40 life, so you can kind of afford to spend some life on your Phyrexian mana stuff with Kaalia and then like gain the life back in the future. I don't know if you can do that in Modern. Like, if you want to kick Kaalia for 4 mana, you got to spend 6 life. That's a huge chunk of your starting life total, especially if you got any fetch lands or thought seizes or anything. I do think there's things you can do with this card. You can obviously combo off with like Aetherflux Reservoir, gaining you back some of the life that you cast, maybe Mono Black Devotion, use Carrick to like cast a bunch of black mana symbols, and then Grey Merchant to gain a bunch of life back. Is this gonna like be super modern playable? I don't know. I saw someone say Death Shadow. It's hard for me to imagine Death Shadow wants a 4-drop, but you can play Carrick, you lose a bunch of life, and then immediately play Death Shadow for free since it only has 1 black mana symbol. So you pay it for 2 more life and then have a huge Death Shadow. I guess there is like some dream draw where you like turn 4 Carrick and just like Death Shadow, Death Shadow, Death Shadow, Death Shadow, get down to like 2 life and just get your opponent, which sounds kind of hilarious. I don't know how successful it'd be. Your opponent might just bolt you or something, but if it works, it'd be really sweet. I do like the idea of like Carrick, drop a Phyrexian Obliterator and then protect it with a free Thoughtseize or whatever. But when you think about it, it's just so much life. You're going to be so close to dead. So if you do try to do this, you're going to have a plan for gaining back to life, or you're probably just going to end up killing yourself with your own Carrick. So Carrick, I'm really intrigued by this card entering Modern. I'm going to have to try to brew with it. We'll have to wait and see. I'm not expecting it to be a tier 1 option, but I do think the card is so explosive and cheating on mana is so powerful that there definitely could be a Modern deck that finds a way to break it, because it is an incredibly strong card. Finally today, turbo moding through some lore rarity cards. We got Frogmyr Enforcer, which I love the design. It's a Frog Knight and a Myr Enforcer. You put him together with Prototype, and this card is notable because now we have 3 different Myr Enforcers legal in Modern. We have Frogmyr Enforcer, we have Myr Enforcer, we have Sojourner's Companion. In a world where Simulacrum Synthesizer exists, where Ugin's Labyrinth is going to be a thing, it could be very relevant, and you just play all these cards together to add consistency to your deck. Plus, the design's just so cute. Who would have thought of stapling together Frogmite and Myr Enforcer? So well done on that one, Wizard. We also got Grim Servant, which is kind of interesting. 4 mana 3/2 with Menace. When it ETBs, you get to search your library for a card with mana value less than or equal to your devotion to black, reveal it, put it in your hand, and then shuffle and lose 3 life. This is just kind of cheap for a tutor. Usually when we see these creature tutors, we're looking at like Runescar Demon at 7 mana. Obviously, you probably got to be Black Devotion to really make it work if you're going to be able to tutor up anything. But I guess even by itself, you could tutor up a 1-drop, even with no additional support. So I think it could be worth keeping in mind. At 4 mana, maybe it could make it in Modern. The ETB trigger is pretty solid, so worth keeping in mind at a minimum. We also got more MDFCs, and oh my god, I'm excited for more MDFCs, shown off by Witch Enchanter. So Witch Enchanter, 4 mana 2/2. When it enters a battlefield, blow up an artifact or an enchantment an opponent controls. Most importantly, it's also a land, and the most exciting part about this is with these new MDFCs, they can come into play untapped if you want to for 3 life. If you remember the Battle for Zendikar, no, the Zendikar Rising MDFCs, those ones, only the Mythics had this ability to come into play untapped for 3 life. Now it looks like in Modern Horizons 3, it looks like all of them, at least all the monocolored ones, can just come into play untapped. So this essentially would have been a Mythic just a couple of years ago in a standard set. So really exciting to see MDFCs return. I love MDFCs. I know people are always complaining, mana screw and just issues with mana invariance. I think that MDFCs are one of the sneaky best ways to solve that problem by giving you more lands in your deck. So you're always going to have a land when you need them, but still be able to play a functional deck. Witch Enchanter itself, I think this could serve a purpose. It's essentially Rexage for 1 more mana, but it can also be an untapped land. So I think this card could definitely serve a role in Modern, and definitely going to be a great card in Commander. We also got Brain Surge. Wizard said Brainstorm, a little too good for Modern, but Brain Surge kind of can scratch that itch. It's a 3 mana instant. It says draw 4 cards, then put 2 cards from your hand on the top of your library in any order, which with a fetch land is an absurd amount of filtering. The problem is we are in a Bowmasters format. I don't know if you can really get away with casting this card, but I don't know if you want something that's sort of Brainstorm-like, or we were talking earlier about trying to control what's on the top of your deck. Brain Surge can get the job done. We also got Glimpse the Impossible, and this common kind of made my jaw drop, partly because my god, is that art spectacular. I don't know who Justine Jones is. I don't know if I've ever seen any of Justine Jones's art before, but that card looks so cool. It's like Secret Lair art on a normal card. So the art is amazing, but the effect is also really interesting. It's a 3-mana sorcery at common, so this is legal in Pauper if you're a Pauper player. It says exile the top 3 cards of your library. You may play those cards this turn. At the beginning of your end step, if any of the cards remain in exile, put them in your graveyard and create a 0/1 colorless Eldrazi spawn creature token. For each one that went to your graveyard, you can sack the creatures to add a mana. So this is essentially act on impulse, except it's also like brood birthing essentially. If you think about what this card does, it can be a 3-mana draw 3, impulse draw 3, but still a 3-mana draw 3, or this can be 3 mana, make 3 Eldrazi spawns, which means you can go up to 7 mana on turn 4 with this card, which is incredibly explosive. So I actually think this card could be good in Modern. Worst case, it is an incredibly powerful common that I think will have a home in Pauper at a minimum, but I'm actually intrigued by the possibility of using this as card draw that gets around Bowmasters, and also big burst ramp thanks to the Eldrazi spawn token, so I think Glimpse might actually be pretty good. We also got Thraben Charm. So Thraben Charm seems like it could see sideboard play in Modern, also another common for Pauper purposes. 2-mana instant, choose one, it deals damage equal to twice the number of creatures you control to target creature, so removal, blow up an enchantment, so also removal, or exile any number of target players' graveyards. Is this enough value to make it Modern playable in sideboards? I think it's going to be close. Graveyard hate, creature removal, enchantment hate, that's a relatively good list of effects that you want in your sideboard. So in some sort of creature deck that can actually have enough creatures to make the removal mode work, I could see this slipping into sideboards. Worst case, like I said before, it's a common. I think it should be able to see some play, at least in sideboards, in Pauper at a minimum. Finally today, we got a bunch of other lower rarity stuff. You can check them all out over at mtgpreviews.com. Shout out to Mog Mob, which is 3 Mog fanatics stapled together, a recurring theme of Modern Horizons. I really want a triple Bugler Rat. That would make me very happy. So Wizards, if you do Modern Horizons 4, staple together 3 Bugler Rats for me, and we'll be friends. Anyway, everyone, that brings us to the end of our very long first day of Modern Horizons 3 spoilers. So, my goodness, does this set look amazing? Oh, it looks so incredibly sweet. Let me know what you think in the comments. What cards are you most hyped about? What's going to see play in Modern? What are you hyped to build around in Commander? Let me know what you're thinking. Of course, also head over to the MTG Goldfish Commander channel to check out the Commander spoilers, and I'll be back again tomorrow with even more Modern Horizons 3 spoilers. So until then, everyone, have an amazing day, and I will talk to you soon. Looking for even more Magic? Well, check out the video about the worst sets in the history of Magic the Gathering, or maybe the budget Magic where we tried to storm off with plot in Standard.